Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the talk. Does prison abolition have a chance? Given by Johannes Fest and Gemma Barona today. I would like to thank Gemma and Johannes for having accepted to give this talk, and of course, all of you for being here and participating in, I am sure, this interesting debate and dialogue. If any of you is not yet a member of our platform, please join us on the webpage onati.community. We will be very happy to have you among our participants. You can share your projects, learn more about the Basque culture, and of course, you could suggest also different webinars and talks. We will be very happy to support you. With these webinars and talks, we would like to bring together alumni, faculty, and friends of the Oñati International Institute for Sociology of Law to discuss some of the most pressing and contemporary socio-legal problems of our time. And of course, this is one of these topics. We started these webinars last May with a series of about socioeconomic inequality in the Global South, particularly in Latin America, but also in Africa last November. Those online conversations create a friendly space in which alumni and faculty have the opportunity to reconnect and to engage in an intellectually enriching dialogue. We plan to organize another talk on pandemic and the indigenous people. We are talking with Professor René Coupé from Austria, and let's see if that works. While the pandemic has created obstacles to meet in person, has also generated new online opportunities for the Oñati community to start new or continue with socio-legal conversation that once began in Oñati. Our hope is that with these webinars, we can strengthen our Oñati community bond and come together to discuss, challenge, and rethink some of the global socio-legal challenges of our time. Next Monday, we will have another talk on how to handbook the sociology of law by E.G. Privan, James Campbell, and Monica Arango. By the way, E.G. Privan is a master's professor and James Campbell was a former master's student. You will find more information on the chat. And we are also planning for the next near future. We have in mind different lines of webinars. One will consist on presenting the doctoral thesis of former master's students of the Institute just before or even after their official defense. We will start next January 17 with a talk on social legal perspectives on the Basque language, education and media, given by Intza Palacin. She will defend her PhD in February in Florence, in Italy, at the European University Institute. So good luck, Intza. Of course, all of you will be invited. Another talk or another series of webinars would be on indigenous peoples. As I mentioned before, the first one could be related with the pandemic, but the idea is to have another different series about indigenous peoples in different countries, Venezuela, Ecuador, Canada, Peru, Mexico, Chile. If you are doing research on that or you are interested in that topic, let us know. And now let me introduce the speakers. This is a great pleasure for me to welcome Gemma and Johannes, not only because of their high academic level and expertise in this topic that everybody knows, but also because they are good friends and active members of the Oñati community, and they are always supporting the Oñati Institute and this important family. So let's introduce them, as I have mentioned. So Gemma Barona, she's lecturer in victimology and criminal policy at the University of Basque Country. She was master's student at the Oñati Institute when Johannes was scientific director. She has authored books on migration and human rights, restorative justice, juries and the construction of juridical truth, women local safety audits, victim of terrorism, victims of sexual abuse and evaluation of public policies. Johannes Fest, as I mentioned, he was former director of the Oñati International Institute for Sociology of Law. He is professor of criminal law and criminology at the University of Bremen. Now he's retired. And together with Gemma and Paula Peláez, another former master students, they are teaching a course in January next year within the International Master in Sociology of Law. His main publications are on police, prisons, and prison abolition. So Gemma and Johannes, I give you the floor. Thank you again, Gemma and Johannes.
Well, thank you, Susanna, for inviting us and making this possible. And so I'm looking forward to Gemma has to has to switch on her mic.
Sorry, yes, I was talking without talking aloud. So I'll repeat again that thank you, Susanna. It's lovely to see your beautiful smile in the landscape of Oñati. Thank you, Inta and Leopold. Thank you, Johannes, and thank you all the people who are with us. Thank you for your kindness, for your time, and I hope we can all participate in this conversation that the Institute allows us. We're going to start right away, Johannes, if you want, because I have this question. I think you are the adequate person to start because you are the specialist. Why should we abolish prisons? Well, how can we answer that? I guess you have different reasons, but just let's put the question right away. Why prisons should be abolished?
Well, why should they be abolished? For a long time, I have thought that prisons are obsolete institutions, that in their early days, they may have been a progress with respect or in contrast to capital punishment, which was the usual punishment at that day. But by now, 300-400 years after, they have become obsolete too. And not everybody has realized that. Many people still believe in prisons, but that is part of the problem. And I have listed a number of special reasons. The first one being, why abolish prisons? Because they violate very central and basic human rights. And that was not yet the case when prisons were invented, because there was no General Charter of Human Rights, and there was not the European Charter of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights. All these are new inventions, and by those standards, prisons are obsolete.
Perhaps we can go to the our second question, or what do you think? Or should we?
Well, fine with me. If maybe I could, at the end of that first question, I could still add that abolitionism, penal abolitionism, has made a comeback recently. When I came across those ideas, Luc-Hülsmann, Matthiessen, Christie, this was early in my days as a professor in Oñati, but even before in Bremen. But then abolitionism kind of went out of style, out of people did not appreciate that so much anymore. But it has come back in the last 10 years in force. And to my amazement, there is the first really international handbook on penal abolition, which is a very fine book, unfortunately quite expensive, but you should try to find it in the libraries. Thank you. So that.
May I just one sec,
yes,
Johannes, may
please.
I say that my experience, I don't know, it's the same, the people who are here with us and your own experience, when, of course, it's also because of the age, but when I talk about abolitionism in class to my students, criminology and law students, they like the idea. Of course, there are some skepticism in terms of being a utopia or being something that can be put in force in practical terms and really be an alternative to the whole system. But because of course we can talk about abolition of prisons and abolition even of the whole criminal justice system, right? But abolition of prisons. And so it seems to me like students, younger students have always been interested, maybe at the level of the academia work, we can see that lowering of the interest. But it seems to me like young people and young students, and that of course has to be contextualized and might be different in different countries. But as part of my teaching here in the Basque Country, I think the students have always been interested, but they only get very few information on the abolitionist movement in the faculties of law. Just to add something else.
Okay, we'll come back to that, and I will now ask you a question for a change, and that question is, when I came to meet you in Oñati, you were the one I learned about restorative justice, and you have been strong on that for many decades now. So the question is restorative justice a kind of abolitionism? What do you think?
Well, Johannes, I think it's not. I mean, restorative justice is not abolitionism, although it owes a lot to abolitionism. And maybe for some people, it might be some kind, and I saw here our colleague also, Otmar, and probably he will have something to say to that. But it owes a lot, because we have to think that restorative justice is born out of that mythical moment in Canada, in Ontario, with the Kitchener experiment in relation to crime of vandalism, vandalizing private and public property, and people who were practitioners working mainly for the rights of young offenders proposed that instead of following the ordinary process of the criminal justice system for young people that is so stigmatizing, to meet victims and offenders, very diverse victims and offenders, in that case of Elmira case, and trying to agree some form of reparation. And that would be the response to the crime. From that moment on, start to a conceptualization on what restorative justice was by Howard Ter and others, very much influenced by the Mennonite and other religious groups. But nowadays, not only nowadays, we have United Nations principles. We have also recommendation by the Council of Europe, and we have a mandatory, and this is hard law, we have a European Union directive on the rights of victims. This is very interesting, because starting more as an alternative from the point of view of the rights of the offenders, now it's more conceptualized or under this umbrella of victims' rights, because something surprising has happened. And for me, that's interesting in terms of questioning the criminal justice system, questioning that restorative justice, that free dialogue for reparation in a creative way, to try to focus on the relationships that are broken. So as you said, crime not defined as a violation of abstract norms, but crime understood as concrete harm of concrete people with concrete consequences, not only for the victims, but also for the offenders, the families, the society, the community affected. Can offer a kind of conversation, so a difficult conversation. And the first assumption is that victims and offenders don't want to meet. And what we discover since the Elmira experiment, the Kitchener experiment in the mid-70s, is that many victims and offenders want to meet, and particularly in serious crimes. Because usually the system, the criminal justice system, provide for restorative justice for young people and in minor cases. And the evolution that we have seen since the mid-70s is that restorative justice is expanding for adults, of course, in all countries, also taking into account some forms of indigenous community justice, although I think, and this is right, is not true that is really indigenous justice, is a readaptation. And with some criticism, I will refer later. But we see that it questions. For me, restorative justice is interesting in relation to abolitionism because it questions many assumptions of the criminal justice system itself. like victims and offenders don't want to meet. We cannot repair things like murder. That seems to be irreparable in that sense. Or think that we can introduce spaces of justice that are free will, that are participatory, and that are based on dialogue, not on imposition. That in theory, and that is something that even we have international standards, some of which are hard law. Now, what happens, of course, is that when we do external evaluation on how restorative justice is working, I think there is a real risk, and there have been many workshops in Oñati by Jacques Paget and others on this. Of course, the theory, the big gap that we study in sociology of law between theory and practice, of course, there we have. And what is supposed to be in terms of good standards and what is happening is it might be very different. And we have now many studies, particularly in Anglo-Saxon countries where restorative justice is more extended, that is telling us that restorative justice is not fulfilling the promises of real participation of unequal people that who are already discriminated in society, that maybe restorative justice is falling into net widening, a very much known effect in criminology in terms of alternatives, and it might not be as transformative as it promises, in the sense that restorative justice promises an encounter after many preparatory meetings, promise an encounter of dialogue about what happened and the impact of what happened to repair, for reparation, to go on living for reparation, examining the conditions that favor that victimization, because we have to change those conditions, and also questioning the same also concept of victims and offenders, right?
Gemma,
yeah, sorry.
maybe you want to finish, but maybe I already have at least 2 questions to you.
Perfect.
To what you have been saying, and one of them, almost in the style you formulated your questions. First of all, there seem to be a number of areas where restorative justice doesn't seem to apply. Now, all these occasions where the victim is a corporation or is a warehouse or a shop of sorts, or the public transport. And so what do we do with that? Is there an answer from restorative justice?
Yeah, for me, at the very end, we are talking about relationships that that produces harm in the sense, now there is a new branch of knowledge called semiology, right? In criminology as well, not to take the concept of crime or traumatic event in the language of psychologists, or suffering in the language of philosophers, but more sociology of law, the notion of harm, right? Being criminalized or not. And this is just another kind of harm, just as you say that we need different responses for different kinds of actions, behaviors, or conduct. And for example, we have a specific project, and we are developed right now with different universities, together with Bruna Pali as well, for example, on restorative justice for environmental crimes and crimes against animals. That are not considered victims. They are not considered victims in themselves, the environment, or not even the animals, right? Yep. And also we have with white collar crime, with like money laundering and other kinds of crime. My glasses just broke. Well, and then yeah, I'm so lucky. And then I think this is interesting. This is what in victimology we call diffuse victimization, which means that the whole society is a victim. Of course, you might not feel it that way, but in that sense, and it's possible. The problem in restorative justice is that who is going to be the spokesman? That's a woman who is going to be sitting in the cycle. For this kind of victimization, we don't need bilateral mediation, but we need a big cycles. You have to imagine a cycle of that it's already being done of 50 people, 60 people, with several co-facilitators. And I think it's the same. It's breaking those assumptions, because why not? I mean, the notion is.
let me add another example to this difficulty, which I can see there are some answers to. But one of the big problems in prisons is drug addicts. And again, this seemed to me always a crime without victims. And so who are we dialoguing with?
Yeah, for example, there have been concrete examples on this. It's what Sure in 1965, if I'm not wrong, called victimless crime.
Yes.
And I remember Antonio Beristain always said, crime always has some kind of victims in society, but it's true in the sense of Sure was progressive in the sense like saying, if you go for decriminalization of drugs, that's another nice debate, perhaps with Xavier, Susana, but there have been some examples, for example, with mothers, of drug addicts having some restorative justice encounters. And in that sense, of course, this is like two separate debates. I mean, you might be for decriminalization of drugs, but then in terms of course, they never end up in prison, but the big dealers and the harm that they may be producing in terms of drug addiction, not only with only illegal drugs. Think about the opioids crisis in the US and so on. But like two different debates, but it might be possible to imagine like the family members and the owned drug addicts.
Well, very interesting. Let me add one last thing, and this is not so much a question as when Susana arranged for me to go to this Bilbao conference years ago, I met this interesting young man called Jorge Olero Perran.
Yes.
Jorge Olero Perran. And I listened to him, and I liked very much what he had to say, and he has published on this, and he calls restorative justice a kind of pragmatic abolitionism. Very interesting. He says restorative justice is an abolitionist and pragmatic movement that aims to modify the current criminal justice system. Now, I like that very much. At the same time, of course, I still think this is, and he also thinks this is only part of the story. And not everything can be abolished by restorative justice. Probably.
Yeah, I'd like to say that Jorge probably was interested in this talk too. I remember he joined a talk we had with Iñati. It was not Iñati community, but something we organized, because now he's working in Pamplona. He's part.
Oh, he is working.
He's the official. I mean, he's the director of the restorative justice services in Pamplona for the government. Oh, and they are doing extraordinary things. We might also add, because we're in the Basque country, that, well, I am in the Basque country, that the Basque government has said clearly, let's say what happens in the next years, that they have adopted a restorative justice model for prisons, that they have the competence on prisons. And it's very interesting, I'd like to add, that this also very surprisingly, restorative justice is being expanded in prisons. Why? Because it's easier. In prison, you already have a judicial sentence. So all the things with the presumption of innocence and the offender having to agree, like in the Directive of Rights of Victims, it says that the offender has to agree on the basic facts of the crime. And then it's all, of course, covered by the confidentiality principle, because it has to navigate, restorative justice has to navigate in the waters of being an alternative, but being in the system in order to produce some kind of results. And the danger and the risk is that the criminal justice system inertia will just go and trap and colonize really that potential of being alternative.
Well, Gemma, this is thank you for adding that. I was going to mention that also, but now I don't have to do that. Only, but we can almost move to the third part, which is how is abolition doing in Germany and or Spain, and I will ask you in a moment about Spain. But maybe I could say to the last point that in Germany, restorative justice has been almost completely integrated into the criminal justice system, and there is not much of it, and there is very little abolition there. And but as I have learned recently, the organizations are now interested in having a more abolitionist stance, maybe. And I am very interested in joining forces with restorative justice organizations.
If I may, Johannes, just I promise 1 minute, because I wanted to mention Niels Christie, of course.
Yeah.
When restorative justice, the great Norwegian abolitionist, right? And when restorative justice, so it's somehow the same moment in history. For me, it's very important. So the Elmira, the Kitchener experiment, mid-70s, and there we have in 1977 that great article, Conflicts as Property by Niels Christie. And that article influenced a lot restorative justice. Although Niels Christie was not thinking, of course, on restorative justice, was being created at that moment out of grassroots experiments, let's say that. But it was very important for me. I think it's very important in that sense. But in relation to what you are saying, I think nowadays restorative justice has to prove that for serious crimes particularly, is not a private thing. It's not where is the community in that sense. And this is very interesting. You cannot, there is a risk, also different risk, that you transform restorative justice in prison, the kind of, because it's very expand very much in prison in Spain. You can Google it, and we have different handbooks on restorative justice in prison. But it's being more, and this is something indicated by Anglo-Saxon author as well, transformed into a therapy for offenders.
Yes.
And of course, this brings the risk of being a supplementary thing and something that is therapy also for the victim. And forgetting about that notion of justice and where the community is. It's not only a bilateral question of victims and offenders, but the affected communities. And for me, I think in relation to what you are saying, it's very important that organizations and NGOs involved in restorative justice projects, wherever inside the criminal justice, outside in prison, before in the pretrial stage, whatever, to give that flavor of the community and that sense that it's not only a question of victims and offenders and a therapy for the offender or the victim, just to add that. But now let's go to the third question.
Thank you. Let's go to does prison abolition have a chance in Spain or in Germany? And maybe you can ask me about Germany.
Yeah, please. What happens in Germany? Is it really, does it have a chance, abolition in current Germany?
Well, you know, I would maybe a year ago, or let alone 5 years ago, I would have said not much of a chance, not much of a chance. This is just a very nice idea. And I have been more concerned with doing something on the ground, on the ground level, and changing little things here and there. And in a way, I used to be something like a pragmatic abolitionist, in the terms of Jorge Olero. And but the events in the last few years are beginning to change the playing field in many ways. And now let me maybe I should start with the latest news, which is that we have a new government just a few days ago, and it was like, to everybody's surprise, that these three parties got together and had a good majority and found a common program. And interestingly, the criminal policy does not play a big part in that program. But when you look at it closer, you'll find that some of my favorite projects are suddenly part of that program. at least, this still will have to be thought through and implemented and so on, but mention three things. The first thing that is not, that by the way, is not in that government's program, but it should be the easiest, is abolition of imprisonment of children, of minors. Now, these are not big numbers. In Germany, these would be, as strict minors, would be about 400 people in prison. But according to international standards, this should not happen. And we should do away with that. And even this government has not yet come to that point. However, they have come to another point, which had been my favorite abolitionist, pragmatic abolitionist thing. And that is something that is very German. And I don't know how much in Spain there is of that. And that is the imprisonment for fine default. Now, fines are in Germany, 80% of all punishments are fines. You are sentenced to pay a sum of money. If, however, you do not pay, and after a while, this fine sentence is converted automatically into a prison sentence, which is strange in itself because these are completely different things. A fine and a prison sentence, but this is what happens. And at the end of the day, about 5,000 people per day are in prison for fine default. And this is, Ersatzfreiheitsstrafe is the German term. And 5,000 at any point of time, which means there are many more even, because people going to prison for fine default are more like 50,000 per year, because they spend only short times in prison, between a few days and a few weeks. And this is so scandalous that meanwhile, some of my colleagues in criminal law, but also some of the media have taken up that topic. And now this is part of the program of our present coalition of the new government. So we will have to see whether what this means, whether they really go through with it, or they find only some half logical alternatives to this Ersatzfreiheitsstrafe. But I think it should be done away with once and for all. And there is a last point I mentioned only briefly, which is, of course, drug offenses. Again, drug offenses, there has always been a talk about the need to decriminalize those. Now, but this has never happened, and we have a large part of the prison population are drug offenders or offenders that are in prison only because they had to finance their drug habits by stealing and so on. So again, nobody is at present thinking about decriminalizing all drug offenses, but this new government is very seriously thinking of doing away with cannabis criminalization. And that for me would be an interesting first step, because they have to find a system how to organize the legal selling of drugs. And if once they have set up such a system, then this could be also used for other drugs than just cannabis. But cannabis would be a very important first step. So those are my maybe a little optimistic assessments of Germany, but this is also new to me. Things that I was hoping that in my lifetime I would see the end of Ersatzfreiheitsstrafe, of fine default imprisonment. It seems to be happening. So, so now that I have told you about Germany, how about Spain, Gemma?
Yeah, here is, of course, we have to keep this critical mind, not to get too optimistic, perhaps. But answering the question, the general question of this conversation, before we give the floor right away to our kind colleagues online, I do think abolitionism has a chance. Of course, I think most abolitionists, starting with Holzman, they recognize that they were more reductionist, perhaps also Jorge, more reductionist of prison rather than abolitionists. So the challenge is to reduce the prison as much as possible, which, by the way, it's a long promise of the great German dogmatics, where our system is based on the principle, those principles of ultima ratio and those principles of minimum intervention, right? If we really accomplish that, then we would have a reduced prison. Even out there to say rescaling, there is this French also association and movement, rescaling prison. We should avoid macro prisons. We should avoid these super technological, quite inhumane, from my point of view, prisons. And of course, and reduce and rescale. I think that's very important. That is a principle in criminology, that if you create big prisons, you will end up having those prisons full. But it is true that in the case of Spain, since 2012, prison population is decreasing for several reasons that has nothing to do with an aim of abolitionism or reductionism. And I think also that the COVID, as strong as it has been, and this could be another topic for a conversation, has proved in many ways, at least in Basque prisons, that you can release more people than what is ordinary thought. It's true that it has not happened in our countries. It is true that this has not meant a complete, opening the prisons or being reductionist. But in the case of the Basque Country, it has shown that many people can go outside, even people who you'd consider dangerous, right? And for me, this is very important. So this example of the COVID, also these movements, strong movements in France and other places in Europe, in Belgium, re-scaling, reducing, I think are other forms of aiming to abolitionism. Then it is true on the other side that we are not living the best of the times, because we have.
Just a moment, I have to go.
Okay.
I'll be back in a second.
Just go. I might keep talking so that we can give the floor to Susanna. Allow me to keep the conversation with you. The rest is that we have this in more polarized societies, particularly in Spain, where you cannot have a good conversation because you are either the enemy or the friend. And we are living this polarization, one of the tools for this political.
I knew this was going to happen, but
Don't worry.
The mailman brought something important, and today.
This is
again with COVID around, they do it in very special ways, and you have to open the door, and then they put it there, and so on. Anyway.
Just to finish, Johannes, just to say that I am optimistic for different reasons, but it is true that at the same time, and I think this happens in Spain more than in other countries, that we use the criminal law as symbolic to do bad politics, partisan politics, where in societies more and more polarized with extreme right parties. And not only because of that, polarized societies, the criminal law is used, for example, to find that a scapegoat in the form of the migrant or a concrete ethnic minority. this is what we find. We still find when we enter into prison. We go with our students. I was in El Dueso, and at the same time, I want to say one thing, that I think prison has a chance if we work also with the people who are in charge of prisons, and we appreciate their work. I think that is also important, that we train people who work in prison at the ordinary level, the high staff, and we also value their work, because I think society demands prisons. We have to work with society, and at the same time, and this is something Jorge also mentions, we cannot transform these, and we can do many things until we abolish prisons. We can work with the things we have in order that we can reduce prisons, and we can make prisons a little bit more humane, although they will always be inhumane to
Now, let me emphasize, Gemma, that I do very much believe, like you do, that while we work for the abolition of prisons, there will still be for quite a time prisons around, and we have to work within the prisons too. But that should not stop us from reducing as much as possible. And I would like to add one thing to what you said before about COVID. Also in Germany, they are at the moment again releasing prisoners. What they do not do, however, and I urge them to do that, and I hope it will be done, is to have research parallel to those releases. That is to see what happens. Maybe one could release many more people. And that is very true for what I have been talking about before, that is fine default imprisonment. 5,000 people could be released on one day. And this could be a study at whether indeed people will stop paying fines, which I'm sure is not true, because these are different people. These are people that cannot pay the fines. And then there are others that can pay fines, and then they will find the money somewhere, and they will eventually, under pressure, pay the fine. But there are people around that cannot. And that need to be researched while it's happening.
Yeah, we also have, of course, imprisonment because of default, paying the fines. But then we introduced a system that I think you also have at the day fine, so that
yes,
you could have less of that, in terms that you can have an amount that you have to pay per day that is, of course, adequate to the capacity. But so I think we reduced the problem. That was a big problem. I think we still, like Germany, we still have it. And also, I think it is important that you provide with alternatives to also that you don't go to prison, you don't resort to prison, just like you were mentioning.
Yeah, but Gemma, that has been almost a tragedy as far as I'm concerned in my lifetime as a professor in Bremen, because I saw all these alternatives to fine default imprisonment. They are in place. And there are organizations that work for it, and there is money put into those organizations, but it has not reduced fine default imprisonment. And therefore, I'm so sure that it has to be done away lock, stock, and barrel.
Yeah, just to finish, we need, I think in Germany you do it more, just to finish, I think, and this is very important for sociology of law, we need research. There is not, so we don't know how things are working. We don't know the expected and unexpected impact. And it's a lot of money. That's if we want to be practical and try to convince politicians as well, and society at large. It costs a lot of money. This is another argument for the abolition of prisons, right?
Yes.
And so we have to know how it's working in reality. And let's stop if you.
Yes, let's stop our conversation and open.
That's right. Amplify
open the discussion to the public.
Any comments, Johannes, Gemma, before we finish?
Well, I have not so much a comment, but I forgot. I mentioned that there is this big handbook on penal abolition, But I forgot to mention that 2 years ago, when I came back from Bilbao, and which always shows the importance of Susanna as an instigator and innovator, I came back and I decided that we had to start with this process of convincing people. And the starting point was that we devised a manifesto for the abolishment of penitentiaries and other prisons. And this was signed by a large number of people. And meanwhile, and there is an English edition, by the way. There is a web page on which there's also an English version of that manifesto. And we have started a network of abolitionists in Germany in order to implement these things. So much of what I said is really part of this manifesto thing. So this I wanted to add.
Thank you, Johannes. Anything
Gemma?
to add, Gemma?
No, it has been a great pleasure, and I am sure that I'm optimistic, because I think it's kind of a beauty to be optimistic in these times. And I also think, in relation to Jose Ramon, I also think, for example, how come people who are going to become judges, lawyers, they never ever visit the prisons? This is another thing for debate that we also have debated, and we will in the course in Oñati. No, it's not touring prison, it's not treating like going to the zoo, of course, but I think we can work well, and they're very nice. And Erasmus, there are Erasmus programs, perhaps Oñati can be involved in some Erasmus program on working with prisoners, going to share some courses or conversation. This kind of conversation would have been nice to have someone or perhaps in prison. There is also this branch of criminology that is defined as convict criminology as well. I think that is very important, that it's not only we that are outside talking about prison, but people inside to try to understand. I think the same thing for victims. It's so easy to talk about victims and not with victims. They are just, and I think the great mistake of criminology has been to think about victims and offenders like strange things that are different psychologically or biologically or sociologically different, right? So I think that it's also important that we have to have people who are going to become judges, lawyers, prosecutors, and how come they have never ever enter into a prison and have a conversation with prisoners.
Thank you, Gemma. I have been taking notes about the dialogue, and I have taken notes for future webinars: prisons and drugs, prisons and COVID, now Erasmus with prison. I will talk with Xavier Arana, so perhaps we can do something, a dialogue about that. So as always, a pleasure, a very interesting. Any other comment, any other question, last minutes? Okay. If there is nothing, thank you. And I look forward to meeting you, all of you, next Monday at the same time with a new, very interesting webinar given by E.G. Privan, James Campbell, and Monica Arango about how to handbook the sociology of law, the last publication they did. Anything to add, Jose Ramon?
No, thank you all very much. This has been really interesting as the previous ones.
If I may, Susanna, I just put also in the chat that there is also an interesting, and the rescale is also about if let's not take the prisons outside the city. I mean, we might think about abolishing prisons, but meanwhile, we shouldn't take the prisons outside, I don't know in what place. So they are important for the city. They should be small, meanwhile, while we aim at that abolition. And they should be because it's part of the city. So for me, this is also an interesting idea. While thinking of the horizon of abolishing prisons shouldn't be in a place where we cannot see them, and where, you know, that it's also in criminological terms more opportunity for abuses as well, being very far away.
Oh, very true. Okay.
So thank you, everybody.
Bye bye.
And hope to see you in the next webinars.
Thank you,
if we,
Susana.
if we don't see each other, have a fine end of year and a better, even better beginning of a new year.